The First Punic War was a devastating conflict. Rome and Carthage faced off in a devastating 23-year conflict, leaving both sides exhausted. At the end of the war, Rome managed to emerge victorious, and the peace terms were theirs to dictate. Heavy war operations were put on Carthage, and they had to retreat from their territories around Italy. Peace then lasted for another 23 years, allowing for resentment to settle into both nations. Carthage would spend its time consolidating control over Iberia to ensure that next time they would have to face Rome, things would be different. This would result in a second Punic War, which would see Carthage strike back and rampage across the Italian peninsula. This would devastate the Roman homelands, and while Rome would eventually manage to emerge victorious again, the hatred between the two sides had grown to such an extent that the sentiment in Rome had become Carthago Talanda es. Carthage must be destroyed. This would lead to the third and final Punic War, as Rome once again defeated the now small and insignificant rump state of Carthage. This time, Rome would ensure a continuing peace between the two nations. How? By the complete destruction of Carthage. If the peace treaty that ended the First Punic War was meant to prevent war from breaking out again, it had failed in a spectacular fashion. But on the opposing side, the peace that resulted from the end of the Third Punic War was built on the very disturbing premise that one should completely destroy one's enemies to prevent them from ever risking again. Hardly a sentiment we should seek to strive after in the modern day. We find ourselves now in 1938 in a situation much comparable to the Punic Wars. Germany has been defeated after years of devastating war with the Entente Powers. It has been stripped from land and humiliated, and as we can see with the rise of ultranationalism within the nation, a new conflict is looking more and more like a real possibility. This video will examine the Treaty of Versailles in the context of the current changing geopolitical landscape of Europe, as we can see how it is being eroded at this very moment. But to correctly understand the legacy of Versailles, we need to look back at another historical peace deal, one that managed to hold together for almost 100 years before collapsing, lauding in the longest period of continuous great power peace ever experienced in the history of mankind. I am of course referring to the Congress of Vienna. After the Napoleonic Wars had torn apart Europe for 2 generations, Napoleon finally lay defeated, exiled into faraway St. Helena to never be heard of again. After the whole ordeal, the leaders of the victorious nations were left to ponder the question: what's next? How do we prevent this from ever happening again? How do we make it so our sons can never be sent off to die in the pointless meat grinders of modern conflict again? The answer is a massive European-wide congress where everyone is invited. Every power, great or small, got a seat at the table, however small it may have been. Every country, most notably including France itself. The Congress of Vienna didn't treat it as some backwater defeated nation to be kicked while it was down. No. It treated France with the respect any other great power received, and as a result, this monumental gathering of European states managed to reach a comprehensive peace deal, dealing with not just the borders of the new Europe, but also agreements on the politics of the nations, the rights of small nations, the establishment of a pan-German institution, fishing and transit rights through Europe's rivers, a mild condemnation of slavery, and even a concert of Europe where the great powers of Europe would come together to discuss conflicts before they could escalate into wars. This treaty at Vienna stands as one of the most ambitious geopolitical acts in humanity's history. The geopolitical balance of power that had come about thanks to this treaty had left Europe in such a state of balance that truly gigantic wars were unthinkable, those on the scale of the Great War or the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, there were still conflicts, even in Europe and even between great powers, thinking of the Franco-Prussian War, the Crimean War. But can you have imagined any other time in history where such conflicts remain restricted between just a couple of great powers, instead of exploding into a continental slog to prevent one side from becoming too powerful? This is the most crucial crownstone of this monumental diplomatic achievement that was the Congress of Vienna. But after 100 years had passed, the memory of the Napoleonic Wars had become a distant afterthought, something not even the newest generation's grandparents, but only their great-grandparents had truly experienced, as the tragedy of this bloodshed had left the hearts and minds of the people, and more importantly the politicians. The possibility of another great conflict had once again arisen, exponentially. After all, why should you attempt to stop something you aren't afraid of, or have no memory of? Which leads us to the tragedy that befell Europe a mere 24 years ago today. Thanks to the stupidity and the recklessness of the people in charge of the various European armies, the old continent got dragged into the largest conflict it had ever seen, even eclipsing the old record of the Napoleonic Wars. This war would rage for 4 years and see casualty rates that were truly terrifying. New weapons were used which could inflict more damage than ever before, and even dirty tricks like bombing cities with zeppelins or using chemicals during warfare were utilized. The Great War has scarred an entire generation of Europeans, and it's safe to say that even today the reluctance of war is still present in most politicians, as everyone has had a son, brother or father die in this recent conflict. But still, even recently, despite the risk of war that comes with it, it appears that the very fabric of the Treaty of Versailles is being torn down. The Italians have apparently learned nothing after their embarrassing display against the Austrians during the war, and attempted to invade Ethiopia just 2 years ago. Rather than their easy victory against an inferior opponent they were expecting, the Italians were once again humiliated as the war became a slog. They had to resort to using chemical weapons against soldiers, which were sometimes fighting with sticks and bows against the Italian wave. All this from a victor of the Great War. Well, what does this mean for us today? That means that despite 24 years of technological advancement, the reality of modern warfare has not changed. The defense has such an incredible advantage over the offensive side that any aggressive maneuvers today in 1930s Europe is unthinkable. Even the current war in China, which if we believe in the virtue of having superior military technology, has now after months of warfare ground to a halt, and it will become increasingly clear over the coming months that a Chinese victory is inevitable, as Japan will endlessly grind themselves down on their entrenched Chinese lines. But despite defense having such a crucial advantage in modern war, these expansionist powers in Italy, Japan and Germany have in recent years begun to expand and threaten conflict anyways, risking the peace Europe has tried so hard to build. Upon coming to power, the new German government swiftly tore up a key part of the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans have quickly and efficiently rebuilt their military, despite this being explicitly forbidden by the treaty. The response from the West, instead of tearing into the Germans and forcing compliance with the Versailles, they simply let it go. Following this, Germany then moved their military into the demilitarized Rhineland, again explicitly forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. This demilitarization of the Rhineland was the best defense Belgium and France could wish for, but instead of protecting this crucial advantage, the Allies let the Germans move in. But why is this? Why is Germany able and willing to tear up the Treaty of Versailles so recklessly, despite the dangers of war that come with it? What were the mistakes made by Versailles that allowed this great tragedy to befall our peaceful continent, risking another conflict? And the most obvious answer is that the Treaty of Versailles is not the same as the Congress of Vienna. This may seem obvious at first, but merits explanation regardless. The Treaty of Versailles was a diktat by the Entente Powers, discussed amongst the Entente members with no input from the formal Central Powers. Instead of a grand European conference making France feel included despite their defeat, it was a punitive and humiliating treaty for Germany. But even beyond the process of making peace, the treaty itself was a massive insult to the Germans. They lost a lot of land, they lost their colonies, they weren't allowed to have an army, they had to accept war guilt, they had to pay enormous amounts of war reparations and more. Despite Germany's location, population and development meriting it being one of the stronger European powers, the Treaty of Versailles has relegated it to be a mere second-rate European power, with an army about as big as Belgium. This is the biggest difference between the old post-Vienna and the current post-Versailles world orders. In the post-Vienna world, everyone was afraid of war. Everyone was sick of the devastation caused by the war, and thanks to the fairness and equality displayed in the peace deal, even France gladly reintegrated. But now we have a distorted balance of fear. The Western powers remain shell-shocked by the Great War, afraid to start a conflict with the Germans, while the Germans, and to a lesser extent the Italians, Hungarians, Bulgarians, all feel mistreated by the Paris peace treaties, and are all, despite the horrors of World War I, building up for round 2. Then finally, there's the matter of international cooperation. In the post-Vienna world order, there was the Concert of Europe, an implicit agreement that the European great powers would come together to discuss any conflict, and this happened time and time again over the century after the Congress. After Versailles, a League of Nations was set up instead, a more comprehensive organisation set to deal with all sorts of issues caused by Versailles, like refugees, passports, new borders, economic agreements, and yes, peacekeeping. The big issue? Some of the greatest powers in the world weren't represented. The Soviet Union, by virtue of their ideology, was omitted. The Germans, by virtue of being a defeated power, were omitted. But perhaps more devastatingly, the United States, where this entire idea originated, chose not to join the organization. This left the League of Nations weak, with France, Britain, Italy and Japan as the four great powers, but even this fragile organization has begun to collapse in recent years, as when Japan was condemned for invading Manchuria. They simply left. When Italy was sanctioned by the League of Nations, most of these sanctions were simply ignored and Italy too left the institution. Now that Germany is on the rise, they don't have to go to the effort of leaving this ineffective Frankenstein's monster of an organization they were never part of in the first place. But despite the flaws of the Treaty of Versailles, France and Britain are risking another war on the same scale as World War I if they don't quickly stand up to German expansion. Every little thing the Germans can get away with will result in them becoming even more emboldened to keep pushing. Any idea of appeasing this reckless German regime, as France and Britain seem to be considering, need to end now, as there is no appeasing this great black eagle of National Socialism. You can keep feeding it tribute after tribute, but it will always desire more, until it has restored its borders from World War I, and then some. There will always be more and more demands to make. This is why today the burden of Versailles has been placed upon the Austrians. If the referendum were to pass and Austria were to join Germany, we could truly say the era of Versailles has ended, and it is a near certainty that Germany will continue to push for the Sudetenland, the Polish corridor, Schleswig, Eupen, Alsace, Slovenia, Tyrol, their former colonies, and so on and so forth. This is why I want to encourage all of my Austrian viewers that are eligible to vote to take part in the referendum tomorrow. I beg you to vote against joining this greater German monstrosity. Us Austrians now hold the key to peace in Europe, and only with our resolve can the slippery slope towards a new European war be avoided, at least for now, or else Germany may very well get Carthaged.